Hey everyone, my name is Tyler Mowry, and welcome to the Writer's Mind Podcast, episode 43. All right, welcome to another episode of the podcast. If you want to listen to podcast episode 44 and all of the other even episodes, you can find them at patreon.com/thewritersmind. You get one extra full-length podcast episode every single week. Check that out in the description of this video or patreon.com/thewritersmind. Today, what I want to talk about is some interesting government projects that I was looking at. And the reason for this, I'll talk about a little bit more as we get into this. But what I want to show you guys today is just some of the interesting stuff that the U.S. government specifically has worked on, and some of these just sort of interesting projects that nobody really talks about, right? So the links for this should all be in the description of this video on YouTube, and if you're listening to the podcast on audio, should be links somewhere. Well, I'll figure it out. So first thing I want to talk about is Project Pluto. Okay, so Project Pluto, or I think it was also referred to as Operation Pluto. So it was a United States government program to develop nuclear-powered ramjet engines for use in cruise missiles. So 2 experiments were tested at the United States Department of Energy, blah, blah, blah. So what this was the principle behind the nuclear ramjet was relatively simple. The motion of the vehicle pushed air through the front of the vehicle, and a nuclear reactor heated the air and then pushed the hot air at high speed out through a nozzle at the back, providing thrust. So what was interesting about this was the fact that the nuclear engine could, in principle, operate for months. So a Pluto cruise missile could be left airborne for a prolonged time before being directed to carry out its attack. And so let me read this. Okay, so the proposed use for these nuclear-powered ramjets, which were essentially engines that could keep missiles up in the sky just for months, right? So it was this fuel source that, because it was powered by nuclear energy, could just stay in the sky for a very long time. And the use for these was to be able to power a cruise missile called SLAM, Supersonic Low Altitude Missile. And it would be launched from the ground by a cluster of conventional rocket boosters, and once it reached altitude, the nuclear reactor would be made critical, and the power from this nuclear reactor would give it unlimited range. The missile could cruise over the ocean until it would dash down to targets in the Soviet Union. So this was supposed to be, against Soviet Russia and the USSR. So this missile would carry a payload of many nuclear weapons to be dropped on multiple targets. It was proposed that after delivering all of its warhead, the missile could spend weeks flying over populated areas at low altitudes, causing secondary damage from radiation, because of course it is literally a nuclear bomb slowly giving off heat and energy. Let's see. When the vehicle would eventually crash, a local radiation hazard would be caused by the reactor compared to the primary payload, but that would not be as significant. So they had, in May 14th, 1961, the first nuclear ramjet engine called Tory, I think it's IIA, mounted on a railroad car, roared to life. And then 3 years later, they had another one, but they had some successful tests. But the Pentagon, the sponsor of the Pluto project, had second thoughts. Why? This is really interesting because the weapon was considered too provocative. It was believed that it would compel the Soviets to construct a similar device against which there was no known defense. And so essentially what they built was this prototype, and they ran tests, and according to this, it was not fully developed, but what they were essentially trying to do was create a nuclear missile that could stay in the sky for an extremely long time that we would have really no idea about carrying other nuclear missiles and nuclear payloads with it, and then they'd be able to just drop it on wherever and also use the nuclear radiation to ideally infect and radiate highly populated areas, right? So this was essentially being developed in this time where nuclear weapons were new, and they were trying all different ways to test them out and make them stronger and use them as weapons. And this is pretty crazy because what the implications of this were, and this was in the 1960s, what the implications of this are is essentially creating indefensible nuclear rockets that could stay in the sky for an extremely long period of time and then just sort of send down nuclear payloads to populated areas or places of war, just sort of at any point. And they were worried this is so crazy that they didn't want to continue building it because they were worried the Russians would build it too, and that would cause all sorts of problems. So this is just and this was in the 60s, right? So this was decades ago, right? Where they were testing this technology. And so let me look at another one here that I thought was really interesting. Now this is really where it steps up. That was kind of an intro, kind of like, hey, aren't they doing crazy stuff? This is a weird one, okay? Project Cirrus, okay? Or the Cirrus Project. Project Cirrus was the first attempt to modify a hurricane. It was a collaboration of the General Electric Corporation, so GE, they make, microwaves and washers and dryers and ovens and that sort of thing. It was a collaboration with them and the U.S. Army Signal Corps of the Office of Naval Research and the Air Force. After several preparations, initial skepticism, the first attempt to modify a hurricane began on October 13th, 1947. A hurricane that was heading west to east out to sea. An airplane flew along the rain bands of the hurricane and dropped nearly 80 pounds of crushed ice into the clouds. And then, let's see. The crew reported pronounced modification of the cloud deck seeded. It is not known if that was due to seeding. So they tried it, and then next, the hurricane changed direction and made landfall near Savannah, Georgia. And so then the public actually was outraged, and Irving Langmuir claimed that the reversal had been caused by human intervention. So what happened was, and people knew about this, because so Cirrus was canceled, lawsuits were threatened, and it was kind of shut down because there was this clear problem, or it came back to Georgia, but it was unclear whether or not the hurricane actually turned itself or whether they had actually modified this hurricane to change directions, okay? So I can, let's see. So this is a document from the General Electric Research Laboratory. Where's the date on this? I don't see a date. 25th of August, 1952. And so in this document, what it is talking about is the research reported it was production of ice crystals, nucleation of supercooled water clouds, and the influence of butyl alcohol on the shape of snow crystals formed in a laboratory. So in the 40s and 50s, and this has little different like diagrams of different machines they were trying to build. And I should have this linked below so that you can actually go through this, but this is just a PDF. And also this information is coming from the blackvault.com, which is a place where this guy is trying to collect different declassified documents for the public to read, which is really, really interesting. And so this is a test back in the 50s where the U.S. government was trying to modify the weather, right? And then this is a different one. This is a summary of the U.S. Navy program and FY 1967 progress in weather modification and control. So research in support of NWC weather modification program, progress in engineering weather modification experiments by computer modeling. So this is Project Storm Fury. flight studies of glaciation clouds, and the Office of Naval Research Program and weather modification. So there's another document here. Let me open this up. And so let's see. And so I'm finding this information from a guy named John Greenwald Jr., who runs this Black Vault website. And what he's essentially doing is trying to catalog declassified documents. And so let's see here. So, and then this is in the late 60s and 1967 and onwards. So the purpose and scope, the Navy's overall objections and weather modification have changed but little during the last few years. During the past year, however, our expectations of what, when, and how these objectives can be achieved have crystallized considerably. It appears that basic research and exploratory development have progressed to the point where it is now possible to commence advanced development for achieving certain specific goals. Thus, increasing effort is being devoted to engineering specific cloud modifications through computer modeling and to developing materials, equipment, and techniques for treating clouds. The ability to perform even relatively simple cloud modifications could substantially enhance the effectiveness of many naval operations. So their goal, according to this document, was to use changes in the weather to make it better for the Navy to operate. So being able to, so warm fog and warm stratus continue to be at the top of our priority, and they are focused on that. However, they also mention here there is nothing to report since the weather has not cooperated. And then they go into Dr. Finnegan will give you some interesting observations on ice crystals, this sort of thing. You can read this document. I should have this linked. But what is really interesting is just their specific and continued focus on weather modification, right? And so here's kind of the thing to think about, right? If government projects were going on in the 60s and the 50s to modify the weather, and they were making some level of progress, even a little bit of progress, what's to say that those same sort of things aren't happening today, right? What's to say that they are not continuing with these certain experiments, but rather than, these documents are available to the public specifically because they are older. I can't remember how long it is, but there are certain declassification laws that allow documents to be made public, and this is what this guy, John Greenwald, is cataloging. So just following a logical train of thought here, they could be doing all sorts of things now, experimentally, right? Technology has increased dramatically over the last 50, 60 years. We have no idea what they could be doing today. And it's highly unlikely that all of these experiments and tests have completely stopped. This is another completely different. This is not about weather modification. This is something else entirely. This is called Operation Chaos or Operation MH Chaos. This was a Central Intelligence Agency, it's a CIA domestic espionage project targeting the American people from 1967 to 1974, established by President Lyndon B. Johnson and expanded under President Richard Nixon, whose mission was to uncover possible foreign influence on domestic race, anti-war, and other protest movements. So, what they were doing is they were trying to essentially spy on the American people to find people who were against the government, protest movements, these sorts of things. If you know anything about Richard Nixon, what he was doing was he was super into surveillance. He was recording all of his own conversations, and you also have Watergate and this sort of thing. And what we have here is clear evidence of not just, one person, but a systemic level spying on a domestic population. And so let's see here. So when President Richard Nixon came into office in 1969, existing domestic surveillance activities were consolidated into Operation Chaos. Operation Chaos first used CIA stations abroad to report on anti-war activities of United States citizens traveling abroad. So when people were traveling, they were spying on them. Employing methods such as physical surveillance and electronic eavesdropping, utilizing liaison services, quote unquote, in maintaining such surveillance. Operations were later expanded to include 60 officers. In 1969, the operation began developing its own network of informants for the purpose of infiltrating various anti-war groups located in foreign countries that had ties to domestic groups. So what we had, the domestic spying of the Operation Chaos targeted the Israeli embassy and domestic Jewish groups, such as the, B'nai B'rith, in order to gather intelligence on the embassy. The CIA purchased a garbage collection company to collect documents that were to be destroyed. So this is kind of interesting. Targets of Operation Chaos within the anti-war movement included Students for Democratic Society, which was an activist organization, the Black Panther Party, the Young Lords, which were a Chicago-based group. They were a civil rights group. Women's Strike for Peace, and Rampart Magazine, which was a political and literary magazine. And so finally, or at its finality, Operation Chaos contained files on 7,200 Americans and a computer index totaling 300,000 civilians and approximately 1,000 groups. And so this was happening in the 1960s and previous to that. And so the secret program, this was a secret program, was exposed by investigative journalist Seymour Hersh in a 1974 article in the New York Times entitled "Huge CIA Operation Reported in U.S. Against Anti-War Forces and Other Dissidents in the Nixon Years." And so as well as that with Watergate, people were very frustrated about all of this. And, according to this, things were shut down, this sort of thing. But the question really is just because programs are shut down doesn't mean that similar programs can't take their place later. And so I've just read a ton of information about Project Pluto, the Cirrus Project, weather modification for the Navy, the CIA spying on its own people. And this is all kind of taking place in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, kind of that era, like the post-World War II era, this sort of thing, right? And the question is, why do you feel that any of this really stops, right? Like, in regards to the organization of the CIA, the NSA, and if we think about what the government is, right? Think about the American government. It is this massive entity that we have really no idea what goes on, right? We like to sit around and we like to talk about who is left-wing and who is right-wing and who's going to be president. And we like to talk about healthcare and different policies on blah, 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 and regulations. But really, when we come down to it, there is this huge organism that is just doing things, that has billions and billions of dollars just out of thin air through tax money or through money printing to just do these projects and to do weapons research and to do all this sort of stuff, right? And what I gave you here was pretty low-level stuff. Actually, in podcast 44, I'm going to be talking about this stuff again. And this is really, really just some intro stuff. I don't want to come at you so heavily conspiratorial to make you think like, oh my gosh, this is so out of left field. Stuff is pretty within the realm of possibility. The CIA spying on, a few thousand people, 7,000 people. The Navy running a few experiments on weather modification, a hurricane gone wrong, and then nuclear missile research was, of course, happening in the 1960s and 70s. And so this is all pretty kind of simplistic, lower level stuff. But what I want you to do, in the purpose that I am laying all of this out to you, is not to say, not to be like, oh, this is a conspiracy podcast, or not to say, oh, hey, you should now believe that the government is out to get you, and everybody's a spy and blah blah blah. The point is, again, reminding what the purpose of this podcast is, right? You are a writer and you're an individual thinker. You should never, in my view, you should never think of yourself as bound to some of these very abstract concepts that you actually have no understanding about. So you should not, in my opinion, you should not bind yourself to the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. I don't even think you should bind yourself to the American government. I don't think you should even, or if you are American, or if you're in another nation, I don't think you should bind yourself to this belief in the, that your government is generally correct and these sorts of things, right? Or just the fact that like they are doing what you think they are, right? Or things are happening out in the open, right? Thinking about actually how many people work for the U.S. government. It could be how many people work for the federal government. I just want to see what they say. Okay, so according to BLS.gov, the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, there are 1.8 million people working for the U.S. government. Okay? And this has a breakdown of where those people are and this sort of thing, but hundreds of thousands of people just in these different organizations, and a total of 1.8 million people working for the U.S. government, right? This is such a number of people. I mean, you cannot even grasp how many people 1.8 million people is. Like, you think you can, but you really can't. And people are just out here doing things. And think about like 1.8 million people, let's assume that is the correct number, that literally have trillions of dollars in leverage, right? In the sense of, the element of money and power gets so weird and nebulous when you're looking at a government, but they have the ability to do these sort of experiments. They have the funding to do weapons testing and all of these different experiments. And I mean, even the U.S. government's military funding is crazy big, and a lot of that is going into research and development and surveillance and all these different things. And so the purpose of this is that I really think that for you to become more of a thinker and become more of a person that stops placing your thinking on other people and brings it to yourself more and more, is starting to realize just how complex things are and how many things there are out there that you have not even thought about, but are plausible and real. And if you take your time to think through things, that like there is a lot of things out there that make sense, right? I mean, you think about the ramifications potentially for your life. Just if weather modification and weather-based experiments have continued from the 60s until now, there have to have been some level of progress in that. And then the question becomes, how is this technology used? Is this technology used at all? Or, do you believe that people are upholding core morality as they are able to use extreme levels of power and influence in regards to the weather, or in regards to, nuclear missiles and all these different things? And I think it's easy to try to avoid thinking about these things, because what we have done is we create this system in our mind that we kind of live in. And that system is that politics matters, and there's the left and there's the right, and we need to focus on that. And we have certain issues that exist. And what happens is, if you really start to think about just how complex everything is, you start to realize that your ideology or your current perception is just a fraction of what reality is, because reality is infinitely more complex than you realize. And more over the last year or two, I have really moved away from thinking about the world in regards to ideology and trying to think more and more about the world in regards to individual people doing things, right? And I think it's important to make that change, right? Because people talk about nebulous systems because it makes them feel like they can ascribe predictable actions to a certain nebulous thing, right? So when you say the IRS, or you say the American government, or you say the French government, or the Mexican government, right? You like to ascribe certain things that, oh, it operates like this. But it really never does, right? What you really only have is people in places doing things, individuals in certain situations that take action. And those individuals can have all sorts of specific ideologies. And the big thing, too, is that who's to say people's ideologies really match, even if they are using the same terms and terminology to talk about things, right? Just because somebody says they're a communist or somebody says they are a capitalist doesn't necessarily mean they are actually operating under the same definition that you would, which means that they would take different actions because they actually have a different belief about the idea that they are holding in their head. And so I think that this can really make you kind of go two ways. One, this can make you crazy, or really three ways, I think. One, it can make you crazy. You can go full on, you can dive into all sorts of extreme history, which some of that is good. But you can dive into all of this. You can dive into all sorts of like heavy conspiracy. You can dive into this realm of paranoia and, feeling of complete hopelessness and this sort of thing. That's one path. I wouldn't recommend that one. Another path would be you can try to just shut all this out and say, nope, I'm not going to look into what projects the CIA have done. I'm not going to look into, potentially scary things that are happening in the world. I'm not going to look into any of this. I'm going to exist in the world that I have. I'm going to stay within my the world that I have essentially created in my mind as reality, and I'm going to live there. And a lot of people do that. Most people do that. And in a lot of ways, I totally understand it. And, for a lot of people, I think that works because ultimately they don't have to deal with some of these larger things because they either, they just kind of exist within their pocket of the world. And as things happen, they make adjustments. And there's some, real legitimacy to doing that, Or you have the third option, which my opinion is if you are somebody that wants to be a writer, wants to be a thinking person, which if you are listening to this podcast, it is very likely that that is you, then you should be interested not necessarily in like specific events, but what specific events mean, right? Okay, the Navy did some weather modification stuff in the 60s. Okay, what does this mean for you? How does it define your view of individual action, your view of governments, your view of systems, and your view of ideology? And not in a way of losing your mind, but in a way of understanding that like the world is a very complex place. Human action is very complex, and things are way more interesting than you give them credit. And in some ways that's bad, and in some ways that's good and fun and interesting. And so, I would challenge you to search out some of these fringe things that, you don't always want to think about. And there are reasons, the reasons that things happen can be reasons. We like to ascribe meaning to things and a cause and effect path that satisfies our particular ideology, not necessarily looking for the truth, right? And that happens again and again and again. And we can even look at elections in America. And we can say all sorts of things in regards to our ideologies about how voting is important and this is how voting works, and you become an informed citizen, you weigh the costs and the pros and cons of different candidates, and you make a choice. When in reality, what happens is an entire system of strategization, understanding who is important to speak to, how, gaining particular allies, and this whole system that really has little to do with you as an individual and what way you might vote. Not that your vote doesn't count, which that's a whole other thing, but more so that your vote is likely just you are being viewed as a pool of some sort of constituency because you tend to vote in a certain direction, and therefore you are marketed to by politicians to do this, because the whole game is not to, show yourself as a particular person, but move large portions of people to vote one way or the other and this sort of thing. And that's a little bit off topic, but the point is the world is very, very complicated. And I think one of the core things that I have realized, and one of my core beliefs that I think is really worth holding on to for me, is that individual action is really what shapes the world. And then we like to come around and prescribe ideology and groupthink and all of these sorts of things to situations that happened, So, these people operate in this way. These people operate in this way. This project was operated in this way. This institution does this. When in reality, it's individual people doing things again and again and again. And that kind of goes back to what I talked about in the last episode, or last couple episodes, about people's, like, how each generation that you exist in is really, really valuable to you, because the people that you're alive with are the most important people that you will ever exist with, not the people that were here, 50 years ago and this sort of thing, because those are the people that are shifting your world as you are alive. And they are just individuals making choices. And we can look at systems. This is kind of the thing. It's like we can look back at the founding of nations and say, here's the ideologies that a nation was founded upon. But how much really does that have anything to do with what we're doing now? Because those individuals were doing whatever they were doing, and now the individuals today are doing whatever they're doing. And then we like to act like, it happens this way. It happens this way. It's like it becomes a really naive thing to do, which is to just believe that you have a full understanding of how systems work, and to shut your mind off from the possibility that the entire world as you know it is totally and completely incorrect, and that all of the ideologies you believe in are actually wrong. And maybe they are, maybe they aren't. I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'm here to tell you to do your own thinking. I hope that's helpful for you. If you want to listen to me talk about more crazy government projects, go ahead and listen to podcast 44 on patreon.com/thewritersmind, and I'll see you guys next week.